Greetings, everybody. I'm Catherine McDonough, the CEO and founder of the Legal Lean Sigma Institute. Thank you for joining us for today's program, which will be delivered by my teammate and good friend, Fred Esposito, who's an MBA. He's a junior, he's a CLM, he's a prolific writer on these kinds of topics and a well-known expert in law firm finance and law firm management issues. Fred, thank you so much for graciously delivering today's program. It's being recorded, so if you have a teammate or somebody else that you'd like to share it with, we'll have that posted on the website. We'll be following up. We'll send the link out to you in appreciation for you joining us today. We'll also be sending you a promo code and hope that you'll join us for our December open enrollment yellow belt. So without further ado, welcome everybody. And Fred, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Before we get started, I just want to preface, this is a topic that could go on for days and days and days because there is so much information that's available to us here and that we're going to touch on. But one of the things I'm going to also have interwoven through the presentation is the whole concepts of process improvement, looking at Lean and Six Sigma and how it correlates into the legal profession, especially in the areas of finance. And today's presentation, while it correlates, it's more about data. It's all about data collection. And we're going to talk about that for the most part today. And I'll pull up the presentation now and get everything ready to start. Okay. Let's see. All right, the objectives for today. What I'd like to talk about, and we're gonna visit each of these little areas fairly with some speed, but to give you enough information to ask more questions and to find out what more we can do to get a better handle. Performance metrics dashboard concept. What is a dashboard? Why are we using dashboards? What is it that we want to look at to manage our firms and our different operations? Keep in mind, I think one of the most overwhelming pieces of a dashboard is what performance indicators do we want to look at? And that always seems to be the big issue. What it is that we want to measure? What is it that we want to see? What are we looking to accomplish with this data? We're going to talk a little bit about that along with designing of a dashboard, how we can implement the dashboard, the business value obtained from a dashboard. I mean, dashboards basically give you a quick snapshot of financial performance. And while some people like that visual, there are others who don't like visual snapshot because it is not indicative. It is telling you in a point in time what is happening, but it's always changing. There's always something going on, and you're always going to see that in the results as the dashboard constantly refreshes. We're going to look at some of the critical success factors. What are the things you should be looking for to see if what you're collecting makes sense? The common pitfalls that occur with dashboards. Where is it that we fall short sometimes? There are so many different metrics out there. Are we capturing what we want to capture? Do we need to enhance our data search and how we dig up data and how we gather it in order to load the dashboards and then, of course, make informed decisions? And then we're going to tie it all in at the end with process improvement and how these types of exercises, while they can seem overwhelming from a time perspective to put them together, the time is very well spent, and it does relate very much to how you do things in your offices and in your operations. It relates to improving existing processes. Dashboards can help promote efficiencies. We're going to look at Lean and Six Sigma concepts, basically just touch on those as it relates to this topic. But a couple of key points I'm going to throw your way to think about before we really get into the nitty-gritty here is Edward Deming. Some of you may know, he is the father of all the total quality management movement. He was an engineer, he was an electrician, he was a lot of different things, but he was a very brilliant gentleman when it came down to the process improvement and its methodologies, also simplifying some of the real sophisticated concepts into simple quotes like this one, which I think is very important. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And I think it's a very strong statement to make. And I think it is one of the statements that drives us to find the data. If we're going to propose changes, if we're going to shift management decisions, if we're going to move our operations in a different direction, if we're going to grow, if we're going to look at our pricing, if we're going to look at a multitude of our onboarding protocols, everything, whether it's financial or whether it's more subjective, empirical or subjective, data is the driving force. And we need to remember that. The next thing to remember is if you don't have time to do it right, what makes you think you have time to do it over? By Seth Gordon. It is a very important concept. We're going to talk about all these different things on the power of the performance dashboard and the metrics that we pull, but we're also going to talk about taking the actual time to get it to a point where it's going to be efficient. And we're all so busy on our day-to-day, and we're going to address a little of those points as we go forward. But to get into the meat and the potatoes of everything, let's talk about the dashboard. Okay, a dashboard simply placed, some of you are probably already using dashboards in your firms and operations to look at simple data. Some of you may be looking at receipts, cash receipts every day. Some of you may be looking at accounts receivable, accounts payable. These are all metrics and reports, but they are all pieces of information that can be distilled down into a simple snapshot. So you can see what's going on any given day. Now, granted, there are software packages out there that provide a lot of this information, but you also have the ability to create your own dashboards. Those of you who have time and are system technology inclined using Excel, and we're going to talk about that a little bit too. But one of the things, some of the powers of dashboards, first of all, graphs and visuals encourage storytelling. I find financial, let's face it, folks, this stuff is not exciting to a lot of people, especially if you're just going to throw a bunch of numbers on a screen. But what is exciting is that if you use visuals, and I'm a strong proponent of using graphics, to tell your story, to tell what is going on in the firm. Let the magic be in the story. Okay, it's a sign of active interaction with the numbers. It is also a conversation starter. People like colors. They like to watch colors, but they like to watch trends with those colors. And I find that for those that are just not interested in this type of information, even those folks will take notice when they see the visuals, because the visuals, as I'll illustrate later in the presentation, tell that story, and people do pay attention. Effective tools for ensuring shared financial comprehension and engagement among partners and key decision makers. Okay, this information is just not there to look pretty. It's telling a story, but it's also giving you indications as to trends and things you should be thinking about in terms of how can I move my firm or my operation in a different direction. What is it that I need to do to get from A to B? I want to grow my firm, or I want to help my partners and key stakeholders, decision makers, move the firm or operation in a different direction. How can we do that? Okay. Also, a process of developing a dashboard can help define measures of success. So we're going to talk a little bit about benchmarking, and there's some things about that I think are very important, because once you compare your data, once you gather this data and you put it into a dashboard, you have to do something with that data. And you have to benchmark it against some level of performance or compare it to something that is going to give you a result down the road and help you make those decisions. So why a dashboard? Okay, first of all, it's a well-proven performance management practice. It provides law firms and other businesses with a perspective of overall functional performance. There are different areas of firms or businesses that we can look at through a dashboard. And we're going to talk about the different types of dashboards. You know, you mentioned the word data. Data is all encompassing. We have a plethora of different metrics that are out there that we can look at. And the problem is, And the challenge for many of us is sitting down and saying, which metric do I really need to be looking at? What is going to get me from A to B? Do I throw everything in there and look at everything? Of course not. But you'll find that some folks do throw in a lot of metrics that don't really tell the story that they're looking for, but they have the metrics. So we're going to talk a little bit through the presentation about what we should be looking at. What should we be targeting? Should we be looking at rocks or should we be lifting pebbles? We're going to look a little bit about that. It also demonstrates firm objectives and goals, and also expectations are clearly defined and articulated. So if we have a budget and we want to analyze this, and many of us are doing this now, we like to look at our actual revenues and expenses compared to what we've budgeted, and then looking at that performance on a dashboard and then going back and reconciling any differences. And that's where data comes in. We can see it on the screen. It can look pretty. It can look fantastic. But it has to give us some information, and it has to give us some triggers in terms of why performance works the way it does. In other words, we don't take it all at face value. A dashboard looks good. It gives you all the information in a concise format. However, you want to be able to take that data and do something with it. My biggest thing is if I see a number and there's a variance, the first thing I want to do is understand why I have that variance. And that's really the key and really the gateway, the beginning of the gateway and passage into the process improvement and efficiency arena, because you're basically reconciling differences in data between actual performance and projected performance. And this is where the door gets opened. As again, it also serves as a diagnostic tool, facilitates decisions, helps remove some of the guesswork. What I find very interesting is when, lawyers will sit there and you can use a dashboard and the metrics and all sorts of data in your firm to determine how to price your legal services. And that's in another chapter. That's in another presentation. So the idea here is to look at the information, remove the guesswork, and just find out with pricing, for example, how can I come up with the right information? What tools or metrics do I need to look at to make sure that the pricing is correct? Okay, that's why data becomes more and more important, because you'll be surprised as you go through the process improvement arena, working with performance metrics, you're going to be able to find out things that you never thought imaginable in your law firms. I've lived it, I've seen it. It's definitely something that is going to benefit you. And if anything, it's going to challenge the critical thinking skills of yourself and also those personnel who are going to be informed by this data. So again, why the dashboard? First of all, it establishes a performance benchmark of operational excellence, okay? We're using functional performance metrics to drive productivity. We want to look at metrics. For example, somebody could say, all right, we want to look at productivity. Well, what metrics should I look at? Well, you should look at billable hours. You should look at total number of attorneys or other personnel to support those hours. What is the result of the work being done? In other words, you want to look at any metrics that are related to productivity. And we're going to show some examples because there are different types. And it establishes the foundation for benchmarking, as I had indicated before. It helps firms work towards their goal alignments across an organization to make sure that the performance is even keeled, that we're finding and identifying issues, and we're correcting them. And the goal here at the end of the day is, by using this data while it's empirical, is translating it so that you're aligning your people, you're implementing strategies, while at the same time measuring performance. One of the things we talk about in the process improvement methodology world is we talk about DMAIC, which we won't talk about in any depth today, but it's basically a series of methodologies: define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. When I think of this statement, aligning people, implementing strategies, and measuring performance, I think of that analogy because that's exactly what we're doing with a dashboard. And we're taking the steps to look at and initiate areas of improvement, areas we can take a closer look at. And that's what the purpose of the dashboard does, is it creates the data set we need to dig, but it also opens the door to more questions and more analysis. And the key here is if you want maximum performance and you want to drive productivity in this instance, for example, it's important to be able to align those resources. All of your firms have a great deal of human capital to tap. There's a lot of intellectual property there among the capital of those folks that work with you. You want to get everybody on the same page. Data helps us get to that point. And that's why this is just more or less like peeling an onion and just seeing all the different layers that we're going to encounter. So a couple of questions to ask yourself as you're really sitting down and going over this is, why are you creating a dashboard? Do you want to just show something that has nice data that shows every month and everybody sees it and they see the colors and they say, oh, that's pretty cool? Or do you need to track certain key performance indicators, KPIs? Are there certain pieces of data you want to look at each month that are important to you? What might be important to one person may not be necessarily important to another. So of course, when you're creating dashboards, you want to consider your audience. Who needs to see the dashboard? Very good question. Usually, and we'll talk about this, dashboards are usually reviewed by key management personnel, people maybe in a financial COO, CFO capacity, maybe a managing partner, an executive director, other partners, in your firm, or other principals in your organizations who may want to see this data. But just seeing it is not enough. It's understanding what you are looking at and why the performance is what it is. And the next question is, where does the data come from? Where are we getting the information? Are we pulling it from software packages, from accounting products, accounting software, and so on? These are all areas that we can look at and extract data from. Some people will look and say, okay, well, this data will support my cause and this will support my cause. Well, that's fine and dandy, but we want to see all of the data. Because while I'm looking at something that supports my cause or my objective, I also want to see the data that may not be doing that. And I want to know why it's not doing that. And I want to see how it's interacting with other key metrics in the firm or in the business. That's the beauty of a dashboard, is you have so many different metrics. And what's interesting is seeing how they all come together to produce one result or identify an area of efficiency that could be obtained. So these are all very important points. How up to date does the dashboard need to be? How often do you need to update the information? There are some people who only update their dashboards once a month. Some people update them every day. You have software packages, you have Excel tools that you can create that will replenish and pick up your data on a regular basis. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when it comes to Excel, when we talk to implementation. You're going to be able to take some of this information and refresh it daily. And there are a lot of products out there that are doing that, but you could also learn to do it internally. And there are a lot of ways where Excel becomes a very powerful tool and a very good friend to all of us. And we're going to talk about that as this goes on. What format does the dashboard need to be in? Okay. As my colleague and teammate and dear friend Catherine can attest to, I've always been fond of saying, the more you complicate the plumbing, the easier it is to stop up the drain. Actually, I can't take credit for that. Mr. Scott said that in a Star Trek movie. But anyway, I digress. What format does it need to be in? It needs to be in a format that is simple, that tells the story, and it can't be clouded with other data parts flying around, unless the data that's surrounding it is also telling a story that either supports or takes away from the objective. That's critical. And that's very important. We're going to see illustrations of that. So requirements of a dashboard. First of all, we have to identify key performance indicators. This can be the most daunting part of creating a dashboard. It's like a kid in a candy store. If you're a financial person, you go in and you see all these selections. It's like, geez, I don't know what to choose from. You could go and say, I want to look at financial statistics, but you could probably get hundreds of different metrics to look at. I don't know how many of you participate with some of the software packages that are out there. Like Thomson Reuters has a couple of things like Financial Insights and Peer Monitor and so on. And you can look and you can dice and splice data any way you want. And the temptation is there are so many different metrics you can look at. you almost want to look at all of them and then scratch your head and say, geez, I don't get what this is telling me. I get this and I get that, but I don't understand these. And likelihood, that's the challenge, is identifying. Okay, you want anything you look at to be very specific to your firm. It has to have meaning. It has to have meaning for those that are going to be making decisions based on this dashboard. There needs to be a certain level of education. There will be a considerable amount of education. People need to understand what they're looking at and why. And sometimes you're going to have to narrate the story so folks make that connection, okay? Also to consider, no law firm and other business uses the same KPIs. As a professor of mine used to say, Macy's never tells Gimbals. The reality here is, those of you who don't know what Gimbals was, I'm sorry, but no one uses the same KPIs. Every firm has different priorities. Every firm wants to see a different type of data. Firms that are in a strategic growth mode may not necessarily want to look at HR stats or human capital stats or turnover stats or leverage stats or any of those things. So you have to be sure that you find KPIs that work for you. Just because they work for the ABC law firm doesn't mean they're going to work for your firm. Also in red, important to the firm, and it defines success. You want metrics that are going to define success. I'm going to show you different types of metrics, and I'm going to have the ones that I believe that are probably more defining of success and more critical to the firm or more relevant. You'll find those will be in red throughout this presentation, because I think those are the ones you really want to look at. So implementation and tracking to guide firm strategy. In other words, if you're going to pick KPIs, make sure that they're telling the right story. But you also want metrics that you will find when you look, as I had referenced before about the budget analysis, looking at the actual versus projected and what the variances are. You may find, looking at the variances, that you may uncover another performance metric trend that's happening that is facilitating or promoting the difference that you're seeing. And you need to explain that. And for example, revenue. Why is the revenue not where it should be based on projection? Well, you could dig down and you can look at that. And revenue, as alluded in this slide, it's quantifiable. These are metrics that are quantifiable, they're practical, they're directional, and most importantly, they're actionable. So for example, if you look at a differential and you see a difference in revenue projection and it's pretty significant, you can drill into that. And then what happens? You start looking at productivity metrics. And then you see, we have some people here that are working very hard. We have others that are not. Could we have a leveraging problem? Maybe so. Let's look at the leveraging metrics between associates and partners. Let's dig down deeper. Let's look at client activity. Let's see where the work is going. Let's look at the timekeeper. Maybe there's an imbalance in the workflow. Maybe some people are busier than others. Maybe work's not getting pushed down far enough. These are just from looking at a simple variance on a dashboard can open up a world of different metrics that you can look at after that. So this is just to give you the proper perspective as we get into the more detail. So for decision-making, these metrics are always used for decision-making. I mean, firms look at data. It's all about data. Are we going to grow a practice group? Are we going to grow a division in an organization? We have to look at data. Only data tells the story. So you need to identify what needs to be collected. Like I had referenced before, big rocks first, pebbles next. You want to be practical in selecting the metrics you're looking for. Look at the stuff that's right at the surface first. Don't get so granular until you have a reason to get granular. Granular will happen. I mean, I'm not going to tell you you're not going to look at pebbles. You're not going to be lifting pebbles, but you're going to lift a lot of rocks first. And then after some of those rocks, you're going to find something underneath and you're going to say, I really want to start looking and drilling down because I want the truth. I want to know what is really happening. And data is the only way you're going to discern that. That's why Mr. Deming and all his fun says, without data, you just have you just have an opinion, because that's very accurate. You need the data to support the position, and these metrics, whether it's one, two, or a combination thereof, are going to give you that information. And it's all in how you search for that information. That becomes very important. You want to be precisely measuring the data. You want to make sure that accuracy is critical. In other words, you don't want to select all these metrics all at once. Because as I alluded to before, some people will pick up and say, oh, look at all these productivity metrics. This is terrific. I'm going to look at all of these. Well, they're not going to give you everything you want, or should they? Some of them are just not going to have relevant information. And what that creates is people feel they have to look at everything, and you get into the whole analysis paralysis syndrome, where you're looking at everything and you're trying to make it all fit. And it's not going to happen. I mean, it's not going to happen. So you really need to be cognizant of picking metrics that are clearly defined and that are going to help you make the decisions you're looking to make one way or the other. Okay. And accurately, if you're going to look at data, accurately interpret the data and act on it. That's why I had said before in the previous slide, it has to be actionable, because you want to be able to look at a metric and say, okay, this is something I can fix. This is something we can address. And you can fix that and then turn the performance around in a matter of weeks or months. And some places it's a slow moving dial, but the beauty of the dashboard, and if it's kept up regularly, you will see that needle moving, that you'll see that dial moving. It may be going slow, but it's moving in the right direction. So the point being made to all of this is, if you're going to make good decisions, you need good metrics. There's no question about it. That's a given. And you need to know that the information you're looking at is solid. So target setting for business objectives, okay? Financial performance, all right? These are the types, just to get your feet wet a little bit. Financial performance, we look at billable hours per timekeeper, recorded billable time. Okay, we look at average billing rates. As I alluded to, we look at leverage. We look at billings and revenues per lawyer. That's a profitability metric. It's a good one, but I don't always find that it's accurate. And we're going to talk about that from a benchmark perspective as we go through the presentation. But billable hours per timekeeper, average billed rates, effective rates in some cases, and leverage. First of all, when looking at billable hours, you want to make sure that all of your timekeepers are working at capacity. If you have surplus capacity among your attorneys, then there's a problem. There's not enough work to keep everybody busy. And then the question is, do we need everybody? Or are we seeing everybody's buried with hours? We're seeing a lot of work coming in. We need to expand. We need to add attorneys to specific groups for whatever reason. Okay, we look at the average billing rates. Okay, we look at the effective recorded rate. What's the average rate that a timekeeper is recording? And then we compare that to the average billed rate, and that gives us our realization. You know, how well are we doing? If we bring somebody in at, $500 an hour as a billing rate, but our effective rate's like 400, we're looking at that differential as the billing realization. That means that's how much we're writing off in time. These are areas that we want to see. We see them in reports, but sometimes it's even better to catch it in a snapshot in a dashboard. Leverage is also another important metric. We want to see how much work is actually getting pushed down. How many of you probably have many partners in your firms that are doing a lot of the work themselves, but you have associates looking for work? That's a normal tendency among some senior lawyers, is they hold on to the work. The key to profitability is leveraging. So that's where that comes in. So these are the types of metrics we would look at. And as you can tell, in many respects, when it comes to the financial metrics, it all drills down to productivity and profitability at the end of the day. Okay, learning and growth. This is more subjective. It's not always as empirical, but we want to look at statistics and we want to look at data that shows that our employees are getting all of their education, they're getting their CLE. If that's the case, we are achieving desired performance with folks. And if people are not meeting those benchmarks as set by the firm, we want to know why. Is it a training issue? Is it a lack of training issue? Is it a comprehension issue? These are more subjective, but they're part of the overall business growth and operation. Employee development. How are we doing with people? Do we have rising stars that we want to focus on? Do we follow the data on these people? Are we looking at their performance numbers to make sure that they're being developed? These are all part of the one operation. It's not limited to the financial performance. Client service, again, we're alluding a little more to process improvement, efficiency and focus and added value. Some of you may recall back in 2008 when we had the recession of all time, depending on your perspective, there was all this talk. The Association of Corporate Counsel issued the value challenge. Law firms were, clients spoke up. Clients wanted value. Clients want efficiency. They want focus on their work. Well, how do you measure those types of, what kind of metrics are those? How do you ascertain whether a firm is moving in that right direction or not? Well, you have to track the type of work you're doing. You have to also look at how you're producing the work, what it's costing you to produce the work. Many firms get hung up on, well, I bill X amount per hour, and I know I'm making money. Well, how do you know you're making money? You need to look at what it's costing you to produce the work, not what you're billing the work out at. And this was the birth of alternative fee arrangements. And they're now fee arrangements. They've progressed over the decade. So, but these are still things that we need to look at data at to make sure we're moving in the right direction. So how do we tangibly quantify value? We only see it based on realization, but we also see it based on performance of legal services, the amount of work that we get from clients moving forward. And these are metrics that are also very real that I'm going to talk about. So everything we've talked about so far has a metric associated with it and can be translated into some data that can be analyzed and discerned as to what its value is and how is it moving the whole dial for the law firm. And we have internal processes, how work's managed. Are we being innovative in our approaches to how we're providing service? We may perceive that we're giving good results and we're providing excellence, but are we innovative in our approaches to clients? And this all comes down into the business development arena, which is also another important area in law firms these days, especially post-COVID. It's almost like a reliving of the problems back in 2008. We're now at a point where we are pivoting, and we're now back to business development has become more of an issue, as well as pricing and other financial metrics. So dashboards have always been valuable, but they're making a huge comeback. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different metrics you might want to consider when putting together a dashboard. I have 8 of them here. I mean, they're pretty self-explanatory. How many unbilled days are there out there among all your timekeepers? How many uncollected days? Well, those are important, but unless you have a specific rationale or purpose to analyzing those numbers, I'm not sure they're relevant to an overall performance issue for a firm. However, net income profit as a percentage of revenue, profit margins, that's important. That's something you want to look at on a dashboard. If you are looking at that, you're looking at your revenues and your expenses and whatever's left over to pay your partners and also pay your, and anything else that you have to pay on behalf of your partners. That becomes important. Average net overhead. What is it costing you per lawyer to run the firm? Those are expenses people look at. That's what people see on dashboards. If they see that actual expense numbers are far exceeding projected, there has to be a reason for it. That's where you drill down into the data and you dig and you find out the variances, and then you try to fix them. And you develop ways, and sometimes it may be discovered that you need to sit there and decide how to make the process of creating and generating the legal work can be improved. What can we do? And technology is always the fallback answer, but technology is not always the reason and is not always the solution at the end of the day. It helps facilitate efficiency, but efficiency also starts with those generating the work. Revenue per attorney. Again, this is a benchmark issue. Revenue per matter, revenue per client, those are important. But unless you're doing a solid business development or an analysis where you want to look at key performance metrics with respect to your marketing and business development initiatives, this becomes more important. For example, you might want to set up a dashboard that shows you how much new work are we generating for our client by cross-selling services within the firm. That's a good metric to look at it by revenue per client. You can look and see how much of that work is broken out into different areas of the firm. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these as we go through. But my point being is this is important because these are just examples of some of the financial metrics you can look at. And believe me, these are only 8, but there are several more we could be looking at. So then we're going to look at operational examples. You know, how many billable hours are being recorded per every FTE in the law firm? Or how are you tracking your productivity among your employees in another organization? Okay, billings per FTE, percentage of partner hours. I'm not sure that's really as relevant. You know, are we looking at partners' hours in totality? Are we looking at them based on billable time versus non-billable time? Are we looking at them in relationship to associates and others? So the percentage of partner hours could be very vague. It's very obscure to some extent. But billings per FTE, how much are we billing of someone's time? And at what rate? Okay, what is the average billing rate? What is the actual work rate or recorded rate? We alluded to this before. What is the ratio billed to work, the realization? Okay, these are all very important metrics because we want to make sure we're billing all of our time. And if we're not, and we're writing off a lot of our time, we need to know why. And dashboards can show us that information if we program it into the board. And we will see examples of this. So I apologize if all of this seems very conceptual, but I'm going to illustrate some of these points as we move forward. Staffing ratios, I think that falls under leveraging. Cost recovery, revenue, and per matter. You know, we all advance costs to clients, and this is an important area, but I don't think it's as critical as the productivity side. This is where law firms become banks and advance cost to clients. And the problem is sometimes clients don't always pay that money back timely. And for a small firm, that can be a significant investment of cash going out the door that could be otherwise used for more, you know, operational or working capital within the firm. So that's an area that matters to some firms. And that's a perfect example. Some firms may focus very much on cost recovery. If you're a plaintiff's firm, and you're doing contingency work and you're advancing costs, that might be a very important metric to a plaintiff's firm. We want to know what's the aging of the costs that are out there, and are we recovering our costs? Or are we waiting until the case settles? Decisions need to be made based on those cash flow issues. So what matters to one firm operationally may differ to another. Now, this is the area that a lot of us who work in the financial or in the management side don't necessarily look at with a keen eye. And this is an area that you could create a dashboard on, basically looking at how much work and how much is coming out of your current client base. All right, client growth rate. How fast are the rate? How many new clients are you bringing on in a year or in a short period of time? What are you doing with those clients when they come in? All right, are you retaining those clients? How well a job are you doing on client retention? You could look at an analysis that shows you revenues per client for different years, and you could see that there might have been a drop off in revenue on a certain year, and there hasn't been anything for a year or two later. And the reason you could look at that data and say, we have a client here, but we're not really engaging the client. What else can we do for this client that we're not doing? And this is where the synergies start up, where people start talking about ways to improve or how to build. That's the power of this type of data. We can look at the growth in our top clients. What does that metric mean to us? Well, how can we continue that trend? What are we doing right in moving that dial in that direction? But on the flip side, what are we doing wrong? And what can we do better? Okay, practice areas per client. Okay, that's very important. You want to see how engaged your clients are with the different practice groups in your firm. Some of you are in the larger firms, you could have as many as 15 to 20 practice areas. How engaged are you in getting your clients involved? If you have a corporate client that needs tax, or you have an estate client who needs tax, or may have a tax litigation coming up, may need to get litigation involved. So you want to look at the different possibilities of how well you're engaging your clients and how well you're developing them within the firm. Number of lawyers per client, number of matters per client. That is a very important metric, especially if you want to discern profitability. I've seen matters over the years where there could be huge litigation cases, and you look at a pre-bill at the end of the month and you see there's about 10, 12 lawyers running around working on this client. And quite frankly, when you look at the bill at the end of the day, not one of them knows what the other one is doing. So this is where we get into the whole project management, but it's a process improvement exercise to streamline and to improve the efficiency of the work that's being done for the client, to reduce the cost of that work, but also how to manage that work. And what are we doing? How many lawyers are we investing on this client compared to how much we're getting in revenues? Is that investment profitable to us? So the point I'm making all along with all of these metrics as we look at them is we have an opportunity to open yet another door and look at another facet of the performance of this client and how they're working. Typical performance indicators, okay? These are the ones that you probably see more often than not on average, and they pretty much apply for the most part to most firms. On the financial side, we see revenues per lawyer. You know, people like to see that as a benchmark from year to year, but I'm going to talk, I keep alluding to this, but I'm going to talk about benchmarks because benchmarks can be very elusive unless we're really looking at the right numbers. We want to look at net income as a percentage of revenues. That's pretty standard. That's a fancy way of saying how much money are we making? What is our profit margin? Our average net overhead per lawyer. In other words, how much expense per lawyer are we assigning? For example, how does one come up with that number? Well, you can look at metrics such as all the timekeeper charges, all the general administrative expenses, unless you really want to get granular. Usually you take all of your G&A expenses and you divide them up by the number of lawyers you have. That could be as simple as that. Other firms could take that number and then assign units and assign partners 4 units, associates and of counsel 3 units, paralegals 2 units, and then do a unit assignment and then come up with a value per unit based on the overall expense that you've discerned. It's all how you slice and dice, but you can look at it. Some people are going around counting ceiling tiles, okay, for rent allocation, which I think is ridiculous because at the end of the day, when you do all these deep down granular analysis on some of these areas and then look at it compared to a general composite, you're not seeing anything really materially different. But the point is you have to go through the exercise to see that. But these are the most common. Unbilled days, okay? How much of your work in process is actually getting billed? Some people like to see this on a regular basis. They want to see that the time, if anything ages in time past 60 days or 30 days, somebody's going to want to know why. And if it's to be written off, we understand why, we dig deeper, we look at that, or we find out why it wasn't billed. And if we do bill it, we gain some productivity, but we gain some dollars at the end as well. Uncollected days of AR. That's very important from a profitability standpoint. So again, these all have a different value to different firms and what your focus is going to be at any given time through your year, whatever your strategy is going to be. Client and marketing. This side of the page, I can tell you right now, is not one that you see on many law firm dashboards, unless you're dealing in probably some of the much bigger firms who are really devoting resources to these areas. Most of the smaller firms don't track this information. Most of the partners that oversee these areas in the smaller firms have a pretty good handle based on their assessment, maybe not based on the actual data. But the larger firms take this very seriously because it is a very competitive market now. And it's becoming even more competitive for the larger firms, especially when it comes down to pricing and how they're, how they're putting arrangements together for clients in which to work with the firms. For example, pricing. Okay, that has become more of a business development avenue for a lot of firms. But it's important to look at growth rates. It's important to see how many practice areas each client is engaging in. What's more important is looking at the dormant client percentage. How many clients who we had not done anything for in the last couple of years, and why? Should we reach out to them? Is it an opportunity to build business? These are all individual metrics that help us grow or help us contribute to a strategy to grow the firm. So it's definitely something we need to look at. So we have to select KPIs that drive firm growth, okay? Higher gross revenues automatically lead to higher profits. Not necessarily. I mean, running a highly profitable law firm that produces great profits year after year has little to do with the quality of the attorneys in the firm as it does the quality of their legal services, okay? So basically what you give is what you get. And the question I would pose to people with looking at these different metrics and how to put them into a dashboard form, do you know what numbers to measure to ensure profitability and drive growth in your law firm? You know, that's a loaded question. And I can tell you right now that, you know, a lot of firms don't. They don't know. They don't know their metrics. They don't know their economics. They don't even know where to begin. And how can you measure or ensure any kind of profitability that's going to drive growth of your law firm or your business if you don't understand how you're generating your income, you don't know what your profit margins are, and you don't know what your people are doing from a productivity standpoint? And why don't firms know? Some just don't know what KPIs to utilize. In other words, they don't know what metrics to look at. Now, up to this point in the presentation, I've provided a considerable amount of metrics, but not everybody is going to know which ones to use or which ones they should be using. And that's where you sit down with management. You all have to decide what it is that we want to look at and how can we get from A to B. The other issue is while some of them are compiling information, they're not compiling it in any particular frequency, okay? You need to measure on a constant basis. I don't know how many of you have heard this in different presentations, but the big thing about data and looking at finances is monitor, monitor, monitor. You need to accurately compare data in an apples to apples format. And it's very important. And sometimes you have to use dashboards to drill down to take those apples to oranges and get away from the fruit salad and get to just pure apples. And that sometimes takes manipulation of data and adjusting data, but you need to have a source for that data. And the dashboard is a good start because it helps you focus on that information that you are most concerned about. But you should not only be looking at it from month to month, you should be looking at it quarter over quarter, year over year, maybe over a 12 rolling month period to some extent. Because what you'll find when you look at data in that format is that's where your trends will start popping up because you're going to be able to identify why something's different. You could say, oh, our revenues are up 20%. Well, yes, you've added 20 FTEs, you acquired a group of people. To what extent, if that's good or bad, you have to drill further. But the point is on the surface, when you look at the performance, you have an indication, you have a set in your mind and you're saying, I know what's contributing to this, but I have to see how it is performing over a period of time. That's why it becomes essential to know what KPIs you need to be looking at in your firm. You know, benchmarks, this is something I've been alluding to, and I just want to touch on. You know, I know one mid-sized law firm partner told me our only benchmark is our own past experience. I'll let you all decide and discern if that is true or false. But, you know, some of the things to consider, many of us work off of misleading benchmarks. And I say that, and I'll talk about this in the context of maybe a smaller firm or a mid-sized firm. So revenues per partner, everybody wants to know how they compare revenues per partner. And they'll automatically say, oh, well, this bucket is in the 25 to 50 lawyer bucket. Well, when you look at that bucket, depending on the firms that are in those numbers, are those numbers real? So when you think about revenue per lawyer, how is that revenue generated? Think about it. The structure of the office could be much different. It could run with considerable amount of staff that's contributing to the revenue production per lawyer. Each of those firms that report a number in that bucket may have different structures of how their firms are producing work. Some may be completely using paralegals to generate that revenue. If it's an immigration practice with very few attorneys, but you could have different variables that are in play that will skew those numbers. And you want to identify firms that are structured similar to yourself, because it's so easy benchmarks to be skewed, because most firms tend to lean towards the larger firms when looking at performance numbers. You need to look at the right size firms, but you also need to look at to make sure that the firm generates revenue on the same platform or similar to your own firm with similar metrics, apples to apples. Each firm or practice group that are in those buckets, if you look at the firms, some of them, it may be an IP firm. Well, how an IP firm generates revenue per lawyer is going to be a lot different than a general practice or even a plaintiff's practice. So when you look at those metrics, they have to make sense. You don't want them to fit your bill. You want them to tell the story. And quite frankly, people have to make sure that when you get all these surveys, and believe me, they cost a fortune, some of them, but you have to drill down to make sure that you're looking at what type of firms are in those buckets. It takes a little while to go through an entire survey, but don't just take things at face value. It's very important to understand the nature of how these numbers are coming to be. And because of this, there's a lack of clear understanding of these metrics. So when you're going to benchmark your firm, make sure that you're looking at data of a firm that is very like your own. And you can understand it. Now, some of it you'll understand through your peers, some of it attorneys sometimes will understand it through other attorneys, but you want to use data that's you don't want to use misleading data. You want to use something that's going to compare you accurately to other firms. That's essential. So as we get into the beginning of the whole process improvement piece, in terms of what we've talked about with dashboards, before we go any further, I just want to show this one screen that we showed, and we show in quite a bit of our presentation, especially in our yellow belt certification courses. Here's a client, how long will the matter take? And the client's like, well, what will the matter cost? And then the lawyer says, well, it depends. That happens in all of our firms. Well, there's a problem with that, because we can't do that anymore. Those days are long gone. Sitting there and saying, well, I think it's about a $50,000 matter. And then, of course, the client gets a bill and it's $75,000 and then $100,000. And it's like, what happened? Well, the problem is you need to look at data. The answer should not be, it depends. Sure, it could be, it depends. But you want to be able to have an affirmative response to a client when they ask you about cost. But you need to look at the data in some organized format in order to ascertain where that middle ground is. So metrics and benchmarking, you got to measure your firm against a group of similar firms. You got to compare specific performance measure across the same members. Just to give you some ideas, rather than taking stabs in the dark, here are some of the different surveys: the Lexis Firm Insight, the Business Intelligence Companion, Peer Monitor. As I had referenced, also now they have Financial Insights. There's the ALM Survey of Law Firm Economics. That used to be the old Altman-Weil survey that took 6 months to complete. They've simplified it considerably. The old Hildebrandt Peer Monitor Economic Index, and of course, PwC Economic Surveys. The problem with these surveys is that they're very pricey. They're not inexpensive. So you need to be careful in terms of what investment you're going to make to obtain resource information to help you benchmark your firm. The other thing about KPIs, you need to use liberal doses of common sense. Okay, KPIs help to assess better and assess firm performance. Okay, consider your firm's specific goals. What is it that you want to know? You don't want to know things haphazardly. You want to have a strategy in place of, listen, my managing partner comes to me and says, I want to grow the firm 20% next year. We need to look at data that's going to help us understand if we're in a position to do that. Well, some of the things you're going to think about, well, we got to look at productivity within those groups. We have to look at hours. We have to look at dollars. We have to look at realization. We have to look at what we're charging. We have to look at a whole plethora of different metrics to see what we're doing, and do they support the firm moving in that direction? And if we identify data that says that we are not, Can we fix that? We can fix it empirically, but sometimes we may have to start thinking after looking at that data and analyzing it on all these dashboards, we may want to do something differently. And that's where we have to start looking at things with a different lens. KPIs can and will change over time as your firm evolves. No question about it. As the firm gets bigger, the level of key performance metrics you're going to look at and how you're going to modify a dashboard becomes more relevant. KPIs are measurable inputs, but they're not an excuse or a substitute for common sense and good judgment. So it's very important to not just take data at its face value, but think about it. Think about how it works in relationship to everything else that you're working with. So when it comes to the dashboard implementation, we start putting data together and we start putting pieces of it. We start looking at it and we look at the pictures and we look at the trends. You know, this is where you get into areas like historical data analysis. You know, one of the things we like to do in process improvement exercises and working with process improvement methodologies is actually looking at historical data. Where is the firm? Where's the firm been? Where are we going? And what do we think is going to happen in the future? And what is here to support that assessment? We also look at risk management, okay? What is the firm prepared to do based on the information collected? You know, does this make sense for us as a firm? The KPI design and the benchmarking, making sure we design a KPI dashboard that is responsive and we're using consistent data. That's why I always say, if you're going to use a benchmark format and you're going to look at data, you have to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. It's very misleading if you don't, and it could steer you in the wrong direction, especially if you're making strategic decisions. Reporting design, the only comment I would make to that is it needs to be simple, keep it simple, stupid. I mean, basically, you want it to have some real value. It's going to have some complex ratios in it and so on. I get that, but tailor to your audience. Your audience needs to understand exactly what they're looking at and to evaluate it. Okay, you need to evaluate the data. Make sure that it's the right data. Make sure that if it's not working, you can say, you know something, we went astray on this one. Maybe we should be monitoring this one. And as you go along and you start looking at this data on a continuous basis, you are going to come up with a firm performance baseline over time. This is where you're going to say, you know, our general billing realization is this. The number of new clients we take in is this. And you're going to start seeing some repetitive trends. In the process improvement arena, we talked about DMAIC. The control phase is the last phase, which those of you who decide to look at Yellow Belt certification with the Institute, you'll find is when we get things to a point where we've analyzed the data, we've defined the issues, we've measured everything we have to currently to see how current systems are working. We've looked at the data on the dashboard. We've discerned we have to analyze some of it more and understand what the root causes of some of the issues are. We come up with improvement ideas, and then we get it working. And we see some real good firm performance baseline data. That's when we start locking it in and tweaking when we need to, because metrics change, but we want to be able to control the performance going forward, good, bad, or indifferent. So the key players in implementation in process improvement and also with dashboards in general are your executive or your management committee, your COO or executive director or directors, project managers, okay? A lot of firms now, since the recession of 2008, legal project managers are in the picture. They're helping manage engagements. They're helping produce data. The data itself is the result of the work of the LPMs that are helping keeping engagements on track. For those using fee structures now or fee alternatives, that's important to have these folks because that data that they're viewing either in reporting or on performance metric dashboards is helping them ascertain how efficient they are and keeping an engagement going based on the pricing quoted to a client. So you're seeing a lot of new players. You're seeing pricing directors now in the mix, financial data managers and analysts. And we're looking at a whole plethora of different people now that are involved in these processes. But most important, the key players are the stakeholders, the people who are going to be is impacted by this data. Could be everybody in your firm, could be your clients, could be your vendors, could be everyone who has a connection with your law firm. And you have to keep in mind that whatever you do with a dashboard and whoever's managing or looking at this in terms of implementation and execution, you have to consider everybody's involvement and the impact this piece of data will have on those groups. Very important. The other thing, as I had alluded to before, you can't drive the car solely by watching the dashboard, okay? You need to watch what's going on with the data, okay? You need to know how well you're progressing towards your destination. You know, as we often joke about a little bit in the yellow belt certification, or even in the white belt, you know, if you see the check engine light come on, well, that check engine light should be pretty intuitive as we're looking at our data and we're moving forward. So that we understand exactly what's going on. And if we need to change something on the road, we pull over and we change it. And that's why I was saying, as performance metrics change, dashboards need to change also, especially as a firm evolves. Because if you are a 20 attorney firm and now you're a 75 attorney firm, you're not necessarily going to be looking at those metrics anymore. You're going to want something a little more complex and maybe a little more direct to help you in your goals. So the power of the dashboards, just, you know, some best practices. Dashboards should include maybe 8 to 10 KPIs. And you want to get a mix of financial and non-financial metrics as best you can. But again, the dashboard is going to be designed and implemented based on the need of the firm. So, but you want to get a well-rounded view. And if you can capture the non-financial information as well in the same dashboard, that's great, especially if there is a correlation between the performance and the subjective pieces, which might be employee development, turnover rates, etc. As long as it's all interrelated and works, that's great. Suggested dashboard metrics. All right, some firms, and again, every firm is different, but ratios make up a big piece of some of these metrics. And some of the more savvy firms, and you know, some that are more concentrated on the finance side, they like to look at working capital. Well, to me, working capital is a P&L statement. Looking at operating cash flow. Cash flow statement is probably one of the most important statements in your law firm. It basically ties out to your balance sheet and your P&L, but it basically shows you where your cash is going, whether it's going into financial, whether it's going into operations, assets. You want to see where your money's going on a daily basis. And that's the beauty. I can tell you right now, if there was ever a dashboard that would be most important to a firm, it's a cash flow statement. You want to look at current ratios. You want to look at return on equity. Some of these things are not relevant in the day-to-day. Debt to equity, especially if you have a firm that's borrowing, that has a lot of debt. How quickly are we turning over our accounts receivable and our accounts payable? How quickly are we paying our bills? How quickly are we billing? These are all the types of metrics that make up best practices. These are I would say, some of the suggested metrics I would use to get a handle on what's going on in the law firm. And it's something to consider when you're developing your own dashboards. Other pieces, for example, cost of servicing a client, okay? Practice area profitability, profitability by partner, okay? Those are great dashboards, but they're also, depending on your firm's culture, can be very divisive. So it's very important to be very careful at what you select. The types of dashboards can be just business intelligence and a presentation layer, which is what a lot of firms do, or it could be task flow with directed action. That's a little bit different, and it's not one you see a lot of, but you definitely, the business intelligence and the presentation layer is one that I find is the most interesting. But when you start getting into cost of servicing clients, that opens the Pandora's box for efficiency and value areas, practice area profitability, profitability by partner. Some firms like to share that information, some of it covet it and keep it hidden. But there seems to be more and more of a trend towards transparency in the new profession. So this is something to look at. And also, which is interesting, is knowledge management, operational efficiency. Definitely a key stake piece that people are looking at now. So the power of the dashboard, lesson learned. I mean, Catherine and I always say this in our presentations. We have moments of truth. And the key to a good dashboard is a well-defined question. Okay, and it really comes down to what is it that we want to know? And sometimes a critical step in problem solving isn't always about finding the right answers, but in having the right answer in the correct content. So if you're looking and poking around in the correct areas and looking at your metrics, you're creating opportunities to learn more than what you might have asked in your original question. So you might, to coin the phrase, you might be getting more than what you asked for. But sometimes that's an excellent thing to happen, especially if you're looking in the avenues of process improvement. So a couple of things as we start getting close to the end here, the power of the dashboard, as I alluded to, you can bring Excel to life using an ODBC. Basically, it's a connection between your accounting databases and certain fields and performance metrics that will link right into a spreadsheet. And you can set up a table that can refresh itself on a regular basis. It helps you analyze data. It helps you build the dashboard. And those of you who know about pivot tables are a great thing. It's all interconnected. Those of you who are looking to create your own dashboards, I strongly encourage you to look into the power of Excel in this arena. And I can put you in that direction if anybody has any questions. Here are some examples that I promised. These are a variety of different things. You can see revenue, net profit margin, gross profit margin. Again, these are metrics that firms want to see depending on the firm. What is it is important? Debt to equity. And they look at it for each year, 2013, 14, 15, and they just see the trends. Pictures speak 1,000 words, and dashboards help us look at that information. Here's another one now, Spacely Sprockets. I'm dating myself here. But you can look here and see, we're looking at hours billed. Okay, there's hours billed. We're looking at work in process. We're looking at the average billing rate. We can look at different litigation categories, look at billing, and we can look by activity codes. Now, what I necessarily want to, is that necessarily super important to me? It has value, but I might not want to see something like this. I might want to see it by receipts and by revenue. And I might want to look at the realization surrounding that data. Those are the things that everybody has their own taste for what they're looking for. Okay, here's a couple of other business development pipeline. Here's a business development activity dashboard. And I apologize if this didn't come out too well. But as you can see here, we have prospective clients by source. Where are we getting our clients from? How much is coming from referrals? Okay, how much from direct marketing? Top 10 clients, okay, in terms of closed opportunities in current fiscal year. So you have the ability to set up dashboards of any type. I think the default most fall on is financial and operational. Look at your marketing metrics and your business development metrics. You're going to find some very interesting information there. Here's a little bit more. Intakes by referral source for the week, the doctor or billboard. Intakes by source for the year. Intake by contact source in the week. Intake by referral source. So you can look and see where your business is coming from. But as a process improvement methodology, you need to be able to say that you have the data already available to you that you can pull from to generate these results. And that's why process improvement methodologies become very critical, because it will help you identify data you're not looking at and how to create it and then get it into a format that everybody can follow. And just a little more of the same, where they get a little busier. We look at expense breakdowns, we look at income, prior year income comparisons, we can look at AR reports, you name it, we can put it in a dashboard. So the general benefits is we're focusing on key business processes, transparency, and at the end of the day, we're looking at process improvement and project management in order to gather these results. And we have the return on investment. Okay, you get a highly productive law firm. The whole idea is to use this data to produce much better, improved workflow, productivity, delivery of services. That's critical. And also to maybe at the end of the day, become a little more profitable based on what you're looking at. So the thing I wanted to just talk about here at the end, because we're running low on time, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. Okay, this is important as we talk further. We need to have a process for what we do. We need to have a process for putting together these dashboards. We can talk about it forever, but unless we have some guideline to work from, But it's important to differentiate from the beginning the combination of both the process improvement and project management. The process improvement side, helps us to determine the best way to carry out different types of work, whether to make it more efficient, to increase or improve the quality of work. And we use project management as a handshake to help us use our best practices to achieve those process improvement initiatives. We need to basically be managing our processes in such a way and reviewing them and developing them and then making them more efficient, not just for the firm, but for listening to the voices of your clients, because your clients are telling you they want things a certain way. And this is going to be your ticket in evaluating how these pieces will contribute to the success and help you, for lack of better terms, help you manage all of the data that you're going to have. And just to wrap up, I'm just going to say, we're all sitting here saying, oh, this all sounds wonderful and everything's terrific. But if you're all looking at this photo right now, we're all too busy. We just have so much on our plates. We don't have time, but we're going to still walk around. We're still going to work with the square wheels because we're getting things done. You know something, folks? You got to stop and change the tire. That's really what this comes down to. And, we talk about this in the Yellow Belt certification course. We talk about the firefighting doom loop. And basically, this is a more fancy illustration of what I just showed you. The key here is you need to stop and smell the roses and find the opportunities for improvement, because by using these methodologies, by developing dashboards as powerful tools to run your firms and to make improvements, this is going to be the ticket. This is what's going to get you in that direction. And unless you stop and chuck the square wheel, it's never going to change. You're going to be constantly in that loop. So it's important to take the time. And in a future session, for those of you who might be interested, we may talk about a client intake project I took on, which really involved this precise issue, and will definitely shed some real life insights as to what we talked about today. But in closing here, Lean and Six Sigma, do the right things, do things right. Okay. The goal here is, and this applies to the dashboards, which is why I'm including it in the presentation, because this is a precursor to what you can learn and what you can do to get and accomplish all of that information we just spent the last hour and 15 minutes talking about. And Catherine, I'm going to ask you if you wanted to add to this piece, because we're pretty much done.
Thanks, Fred. There was so much information in this. I've posted in the chat Fred's email, so you can follow up with him. It's always invaluable to hear from somebody who's, Fred is by any measure, a highly successful chief operating officer at his firm, Rivkin Radler. And I think learning about some of these things in the context of their intake project will be very impressive to you. But these are designed to be practical tidbits of information. So you never know what's going to be the thing, Fred, that people grab onto. But for sure, the majority of firms have no idea of how much effort it is actually taking them to do and deliver their work. And getting agreement and having consensus around the key performance indicators and coming up with a visual way to monitor and track those things is a key to success. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Fred, thank you for another fabulous program. Always wonderful to see you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And feel free to reach out to me with any questions or ideas.
Thanks, everyone.